I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist and professor at the University of Arizona, author of the book Ultimate Computing, and lead organizer of the biannual Science of Consciousness conference. Dr. Hameroff is known for his role as the co-founder of the Orchestrated Object Reduction Model of Consciousness, which he helped develop in conjunction with physicist Sir Roger Penrose in the early 1990s. Stuart, welcome. For the uninitiated,
Thanks, Tim.
So for the uninitiated, let me start out by asking you about microtubules in cells. What are they, and what role do they traditionally play inside our body cells?
Well, microtubules are structures inside all of our cells. They're part of the cytoskeleton, which implies that they're part of our bone-like structural support inside each cell. And they are, particularly in asymmetrical cells like neurons that have very long extensions and axons and dendrites. But they're also dynamic. It can rearrange and move cells and divide chromosomes and extend neurons to make synapses. But then neurons, once they're established in the brain, the microtubules just kind of settle in and form networks. And we think that they process information at a deeper level inside neurons. So in other words, most people think the brain is a computer of individual neurons acting as bits, firing and not firing. But we think you need to go to a deeper level inside those neurons, to the level of microtubules, which gives you not only a much greater capacity for information processing, but also gets you into the quantum realm. So you get non-locality, quantum entanglement, quantum computing, which we think, a particular type of quantum computing, we think is necessary for consciousness.
Yeah, and I definitely want to explore that more. I want to start out, though, with where your interest started with these, because as I understand things, so you were doing cancer research early in your career, and I guess this idea goes back to the early 70s, right, around 1972 from what you've written. So can you tell me kind of what sparked the interest, what caught your eye? Because as I understand things, this kind of captivated you and stuck with you for years, and you came back to it later, right?
Yes, that's right. I had gotten interested in the brain-mind problem in college in the late 60s in Pittsburgh. And although I was a pre-med major, I took a philosophy of mind class and got interested in that. But then in med school, gravitated towards the brain-mind stuff, neurology, psychiatry, neurosurgery, but didn't really appreciate their lifestyle associated. So I spent time doing research in a cancer lab and studying mitosis, cells dividing under the microscope. So when cells divide, the chromosomes replicate, but then these structures called microtubules, which are part of the mitotic spindles, come and grab them and pull them apart in a perfect separation, giving rise to the two daughter cells. And this kind of elegant dance in space and time that the microtubules were doing, separating the chromosomes and moving around, fascinated me. And I had been interested in consciousness, as I said, and thought that maybe there was intelligence, information processing at that level, if not consciousness. And everybody else in the lab got interested in the genes that were being pulled apart, the chromosomes. But for some reason, I was fascinated by these microtubules because at that time, in the early 70s, it was discovered that they are found in neurons and in all cells, but neurons in particular. And prior to that, the fixative agent for electron microscopy had been dissolving all the microtubules. So people thought cells were like interiors were like minestrone ships of things floating around. But then they realized there was this highly organized structure, and the X-ray crystallography had just been done to show that the structure of these microtubules were a lattice in a helical cylindrical lattice. So kind of like which looked to me like a computer matrix, which I just started studying because computers were very new to me at that time in the early 70s, and learned about Boolean switching matrices. And I got the idea that microtubules, to explain how they were running around doing all these important essential things, we're processing information like a computer does, with each subunit of the microtubule called tubulin being like a bit or an on-off state to process information. So I got the idea they were computing at that deeper level to explain mitosis, and also could apply that to in neurons to consciousness, because I didn't think there was an adequate explanation of consciousness based on neuron-to-neuron communication.
See, and actually, I was going to get into that next, because one of the things that you've mentioned was the DNA and the RNA in cells. Those are the long-term blueprints for life. But as I understand things, and I've never heard any explanation for this, there isn't really any kind of real-time dynamic organization or computing, right? And you mentioned these spindles pulling things apart and doing really exact movements, right? As if they were being controlled. But then that comes to the question of, if there's control, then what's doing the computing for that? So,
right, who's running the show at the intracellular level, as a friend of mine once said, and that is indeed the problem. Like you said, DNA and RNA store genetic information over the long haul, but for moment to moment or second to second or nanosecond to nanosecond activities, it's the microtubules and other structures doing it. But it seemed like the microtubules were organizing thing. They were like the organizing feature in all living cells. And so that's what got me interested in them. And I started writing about that and working in the 70s and 80s with some physicists on modeling microtubules as automata processing information, and published a bunch of papers, including the book you mentioned, Ultimate Computing, about information processing in microtubules, which so I would go to AI and neural net meetings saying that the idea that each neuron is a fundamental unit to understand consciousness. And if you wanted to upload consciousness, as they were starting to talk about even back then, it's not one neuron, one bit. You have to go to a deeper level, which increases the capacity tremendously. And so push their goalpost far down the field. So I became sort of a pest and annoyance, because I was saying that their idea of achieving brain-like equivalence at, say, 10 to the 16th ops per second, which is what they figured the brain at, with 10 to the 11th neurons and 10,000 synapses and 100 hertz, something like that, 10 to the 16th. Whereas if you look at the microtubule level, in one neuron, you get that much. You have about 1 billion tubulins oscillating at 10 megahertz, so you get a lot more information processing. So that would increase the necessary capacity of the brain about 11 orders of magnitude. So they didn't like that, of course, because it made their task much more difficult. But by the same token, what I was saying, more computation at a deeper, denser level, didn't really explain consciousness. So eventually I ran into what came to be known the hard problem of how do you explain conscious experience, and that did stymie me. But fortunately, that's when I read the work of Roger Penrose.
Yeah. Well, now for these microtubules, so they're working in cells, right? And you mentioned there are a couple other structures that seem to work with them, but how do these things signal each other or record? I mean, if they're doing computing, right? And so I'm not really talking about the higher, the way they might interact with neurons, but just for instance, in mitosis, which you'd mentioned, is there a signaling mechanism that they use to record data or send signals or anything like that?
I'm quite sure there is, and I've been trying to figure that out for 45 years, and I think we have some ideas and some possibilities. In the 70s and 80s, I was thinking purely classically, without quantum, and for example, the microtubule lattice working like a cellular automaton, which is the simplest form of computing. There's something called the game of life, which you can run on a very simple checkerboard matrix with just on-off states, dead or alive, you might would call them, with dependent on the states of their neighbors at the previous generation. So it was a kind of a farcical copy of life itself. But if you run this on a simple computer, simple checkerboard, you get patterns and gliders that move around and can perform computations. So with my physicist colleagues like Steen Rasmussen and Jack Tuszynski, we modeled microtubules as the automaton and showed patterns based on the oscillations that we knew existed in microtubules. We saw patterns of different states of tubulin moving and processing around the microtubule. And because of the cylindrical nature, and also because of the Fibonacci geometry, we got particularly interesting patterns in the automata characteristic of the microtubule structure, which could process information from one along a microtubule or throughout a neuron and communicate with other microtubules and other structures by microtubule-associated proteins that would attach from one particular area of the microtubule to another microtubule or to the membrane, or the microtubules would transport material, or material would be transported along them. And then another mode of communication would be vibrational resonance and then eventually electromagnetic and possibly quantum vibrations, which I got into later. So, in fact, my book was about different modes of information processing in microtubules that various people had come up with. There were a couple dozen different ideas of how microtubules were so intelligent and so smart and how they could process information through basically computation and or vibrational mechanisms.
Yeah. And so that was in Ultimate Computing, which you published in 1987. And right. So if I understand correctly, that was before, and again, you touched on this, so I'm jumping around a little my questions. That was before you had started to work with Roger Penrose, right? So really that was, if I understand things correctly, that was really before you dug down into the quantum model as deeply, right?
Exactly. I didn't really know much about quantum mechanics. The physicists I work with knew about it. I did know about Froelich coherence, though. Froelich was a biophysicist who thought there was this quantum coherence in biology among proteins that were embedded in a geometrical constraint, like proteins in a membrane, and that regions inside the proteins that are called nonpolar regions without charge of, for example, pi resonance electron clouds and aromatic amino acids that would couple and oscillate and give if they're constrained in a geometry like a membrane or a microtubule, and if there's ambient energy, even heat, they would pump coherently. And Froelich proposed this mechanism in the early 70s, and so the ambient heat bath would pump the microtubule, in this case, kind of like a laser, to give rise to coherence. And so I had mentioned that without really delving into the nature of the physics, but I hadn't considered really the quantum mechanics per se. But then I was in an AI meeting, and I think somebody said to me, "Okay, wise guy, basically, let's say you're right. There's all this information processing in microtubules. How will that explain consciousness, love, joy, feelings, emotions, what we now call qualia, and what we now call the heart problem, thanks to Chalmers, who came along later." But I had to admit I was stumped. I had no idea that I hadn't really considered the fact that computation doesn't necessarily lead to consciousness.
Yeah, and I should apologize for jumping in, but so I guess one of the other aspects of this too, and so conventionally speaking, you've got neurons and you have synapses, and people are familiar with, I think most folks are familiar with that. And then you've got the neurotransmitters, right? Serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. And so those are mitigating, as well as like acetylcholine. And so those are mitigating the communication, those impulses. So your study with the microtubules, one of the things I wondered was, right now, the model you've said that this is a flawed model. Right now, the model is that the brain is kind of sort of like a computer where these neurons are firing down synapses. So how would the microtubules they would be doing some computation, I guess, in your description of things. Would they be mitigating almost like the neurotransmitters do, these signals?
Well, okay, so like you said, most people say the brain's a computer of neurons based on the Hodgkin-Huxley integrated fire neuron from the 50s, where the dendrites and soma take in information through synapses, which, according to the standard dogma, is mediated strictly by electrochemical fluctuations along the membrane of the dendrites and soma, called the excitatory postsynaptic potentials and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, which are integrated until reaching a threshold at what's called the axon hillock, or it's actually now called the axon initiation segment, near where the axon takes off from the cell body. And when that threshold is met, at a particular membrane voltage, according to the Hodgkin-Huxley approach, it triggers a firing down the axon to the next to release neurotransmitters down at the next synapse further down the axon. And once the axon is triggered, the action potential, or the spike it's called, travels all or none. Once it starts, it just keeps going, and it goes and releases neurotransmitter down at the next synapse. And that's considered an all or none. Once it fires, it fires. So the firings are very amenable to AI models. So most AI-like models of the brain consider the firings as the digital bits, and the dendrites as just kind of the collectors of the information. But there's they do the integration up to the threshold. But there's a couple problems with that. If you look in neurons in awake animals, the threshold from spike to spike varies from firing to firing, from spike to spike. So there's some other factor controlling the spiking, whether a neuron fires or not. So I think of the firing as kind of after the fact in terms of consciousness, that is just enacting the output of the conscious decision, which occurs in the dendrites and soma, and interacts with the membrane potential to influence the firing. And this is where consciousness can come in to modulate firing. And I kind of think of firing as exerting behavior. It's kind of a microcosm that you make. The consciousness happens in the dendrites and soma. You make a decision, and bam, trigger an axon that makes you wiggle your finger or utter a particular word or whatever action you may do. So that's where the causality comes in. It's also where you can break from determinism, which would be the case in strictly the Hodgkin-Huxley neuron. So I think consciousness is happening at a deeper level, particularly in the dendrites and soma, in microtubules in dendrites and soma of brain neurons, and in particular brain neurons, which are cortical layer 5 pyramidal cells, which are in the cortex. I think they're the best bets for where consciousness is happening, although I think it can happen anywhere. But in terms of moment to moment, most likely area, that's where I bet on, because these big arrays of microtubules receiving all this information, and the microtubules in dendrites and soma are unique in all of biology in that they're interrupted in a mixed polarity. So you think of them as part of the cytoskeleton, but yet they're broken and arrayed in anti-parallel fashion, so that one pointing up is next to one pointing down. They have a charge polarity, and that could make them optimal for information processing. And also, when they resonate, they're going to be slightly off and give rise to interference beats. And we think that interference beats in the microtubules at very fast frequencies that are slightly off in their frequency will give rise to slower interference beats, giving rise to slower things like EEG. And it's also kind of more like music. I prefer the metaphor, rather than the brain as a computer and the consciousness as a computation, that the brain is more like an orchestra, a quantum orchestra, and consciousness is more like music. And I think it's happening in the dendrites, not in the firings or spikes. The firings or spikes that everybody thinks of as the ones or zeros of computation, I think are actually kind of after the fact. The consciousness happens in the dendrites and soma, and then the firings kind of carries out the message. That's a different.
Yeah. So would it be fair to say then that on a quantum level, and I should apologize, you're going fast. I'm trying to follow on a quantum level.
I apologize for going too fast. Sorry about that.
Well, so the processing happens like in the cells on a quantum level, right? And then so you're suggesting then that the spikes are actually more about coupling what's happening on a quantum level to the rest of the mind. Does that sound right?
Correct, or to the brain to exert. I would consider the mind to be the consciousness. So the spikes are carrying out the decisions or the actions or the outputs of consciousness to the classical world, to your body, through your axonal spikes. So unlike the spikes being conscious that most people have said, mediating consciousness, I think their consciousness is in the integration phase. If you go back to integrate and fire, the basic model of a neuron, I think consciousness is in the integration, but coupled integration among the microtubules and many neurons that are quantum coherently entangled. So you get like brain-wide quantum fields that also interact at the local level in the microtubules, which then affect firing and behavior. Basically, the firing controls behavior, but consciousness is in the integration phase before the firing.
Now, one of the things I guess that supports this, and this, I guess this helped you to flesh out your theories too, was as an anesthesiologist, you've written that the medicines that you work with have an effect on microtubules, and that affecting the microtubules helps put people unconscious, right?
Yeah, anesthesia is probably the best way to understand consciousness, I think, because it's very specific, particularly the gases. There's also other types of anesthetics, but if you just consider the gases that you breathe in, and this was discovered in the 19th century, that there are a bunch of gases, and if you breathe them in at low concentrations, you get kind of giddy and euphoric. And these were actually used for party substances, ether frolics and nitrous oxide laughing gas. And at low concentrations, people danced around and laughed and giggled and had a wonderful time. If you went to a higher concentration, however, they would lose consciousness and fall asleep. And if you gave them too much, they would stop breathing. But there was a level where you would keep them unconscious, but they'd keep on breathing and would be okay. And it was discovered you could use that to do surgeries while they were unconscious. So, but anesthesia is selective. It goes in. It's a paradox. It's selective, but it's also very nonspecific. The anesthetic gases go into the body. You breathe them in, and they go into the lungs, and then they go into the bloodstream and are carried throughout the body, and go to fat and lipid-like areas all over the body in huge amounts. There's a lot of this stuff in you when you're under anesthesia, but it doesn't do anything except for affect consciousness. And they act by very weak quantum interactions and don't affect non-conscious processing. The brain is still quite active. You could do evoked potentials and responses and so forth, but what's missing is consciousness. And because of that, it seemed like because of the non-specificity, a lot of people didn't think they were good avenues. But it occurred to me anyway that what that tells us is that consciousness is a highly organized quantum process, a highly dynamic and unified quantum process, so that it can be easily perturbed by these anesthetic gases with their weak quantum interactions. And also, if they were unified, like in a condensate, like a full coherence state, if you perturb any part of it, the whole thing gets out of coherence. So they would be sensitive to anesthetic action, whereas everything else, which is going on at a more classical level in the body and the brain, are unaffected. So that would explain how anesthetics can do that, can affect consciousness and nothing else if consciousness is a highly organized quantum process. So then the question became well, where? And initially, in the study of anesthesia, people thought they acted in, because of the lipid-like solubility, they thought they acted in lipid portions of membranes, but then it became apparent that the proteins in the membranes are doing the action, so they were then thought to act extrinsically in the lipid onto the protein, but eventually people, so they're not even considering microtubules, everybody's looking at the membrane proteins, receptors on the dendritic side, and lo and behold, they do bind directly to membrane proteins, but so that was the assumption. They act on membrane proteins, receptors for acetylcholine, GABA, serotonin, glycine, and some others. But there wasn't any. But there wasn't any uniform effect. They did. One anesthetic would open a channel. Another anesthetic would close the same channel. Some anesthetics didn't bind to all the channels. So the whole story kind of fell apart in the late 2000s, 2008, and people began looking around elsewhere, and lo and behold, it was found that anesthetics bind to microtubules, although the binding at a lower binding affinity, but because there's so many tubulins, there's so much of it, there's a fair amount of activity of anesthetics, in the microtubules when consciousness goes away. But the question is, what do they do there? What are they inhibiting that's causing consciousness? And we did a computer model in 2017. It was published in Nature Scientific Reports, where on a big computer, my colleagues modeled one tubulin, one subunit of protein, of the microtubule protein, which has 86 of these pi resonance aromatic rings that couple and oscillate with these quantum interactions. So we computer modeled the quantum interactions among the 86 aromatic amino acids and found a spectrum of activity in the terahertz range, with a peak at about 613 terahertz, which is in the blue-green region of the spectrum. So we saw this peak, and then we added anesthetics, all the different anesthetics in the computer simulation, one at a time, I should say. And sure enough, every anesthetic abolished this 613 terahertz peak, meaning that it was a correlate of consciousness, at least in this model. And we also looked at gases that were non-anesthetics that bind in the same place but don't cause anesthesia, and they did not dampen the 613 terahertz peak. So we think that's and we showed why, because their polarizability was too high. But the point is that this resonance peak in tubulin seems to be the best correlate of consciousness, since these effects all match the potency of the different anesthetics. So, we contend that anesthetics act by dampening these terahertz vibrations in microtubules, which otherwise somehow give rise to consciousness.
Okay. Now, so this really brings you to, this is work that you've done with Penrose, and so this has brought you to working with Sir Roger Penrose on this.
Right.
Now,
excuse me, the anesthetic stuff was done with Travis Craddock, Jack Dusinski, and other people. Although Roger was definitely interested in it, and we do continue to collaborate. But Travis Craddock did that anesthetic work in his group.
Well, yeah, and so that was what I wanted to explore a little bit was your work with Sir Roger Penrose, because that I think that's the other half of it. Now he wrote The Emperor's New Mind, right? And I think he was proposing kind of a general quantum model for the brain. But then when you learned about that and you started collaborating, it sounds like that you guys were able to really put the pieces together. Is that right?
Yeah. So when I ran into the problem that I was a reductionist, and that all the microtubule information processing in the world wouldn't give rise to qualia, feelings, colors, conscious awareness, and so forth. That same person, fortunately, suggested I read a book by Roger called The Emperor's New Mind, which was written in '89, but I think I read it in '91 or so. And The Emperor's New Mind was kind of a goof on AI, and the Emperor might have been Marvin Minsky, I'm not sure, but the whole point was that in terms of producing consciousness, they were faking it, and they didn't really have a mechanism, and that just computation per se was not the same as consciousness. And he approached that by a philosophical avenue and mathematical Gödel's theorem, which basically said you kind of have to be outside the quantum system to understand anything. And that also gets you out of determinism, or at least algorithmic determinism, and gives an avenue for consciousness or creativity, insight, what Roger called non-computable effects. There might be platonic values embedded in the universe that could influence our conscious thought somehow, and that somehow had to do with the collapse of the wave function. And so I read this, and I was pretty much blown away by it. I had a vague understanding of quantum mechanics, but not really. But Roger's approach was so engaging, and the way he did it with cartoons, diagrams, and so forth, I really appreciate it. So I kind of grokked it, and what he was saying, he was approaching the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, which is a completely different problem to explain consciousness. And accordingly, he's been criticized, and we've been criticized that we're using one mystery to solve another mystery, the mystery of quantum mechanics to solve the mystery of consciousness. And maybe they're related, and I think there's reason to think that. So, with the fact that supposedly consciousness causes quantum state reduction with Schrodinger's cat and so forth, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So, in the book, he began. So the measurement problem is that something at the microscopic quantum level, like a particle, an electron, or an atom, can be in superposition of multiple states or locations at the same time. It can be a spin up and a spin down. It can be both here and there at the same time. But when you measure it, if you make a measurement on it and try to where it is or consciously observe it, the particles reduce or collapse to definite states or locations. And so they go from a quantum state of say 1 and 0 to either 1 or 0. And in fact, this is used in quantum computers at incredible speed and efficiency and so forth. But the question is, why do they collapse? Why does measurement cause it, or does measurement cause it? And there are other theories about what happens. One is if the superpositions, each possibility continues, and each forms its own universe or goes along into its own universe, and there's never any reduction. They each kind of amplify to another world, the multiple worlds hypothesis. And some people said that the quantum state would run into the classical state and decohere, but that doesn't really work either, because at the microscopic level, everything is quantum anyway. And then there are theories that said that there was an objective threshold for reduction. That could be the number of particles in one case, or in Roger's case, it had to do with quantum gravity. And just when I thought this was really weird, he starts going into quantum gravity, which was something I had never even considered. But he presented it in a very simple way. Quantum gravity basically meaning the structure of the universe. If you go down in scale, towards the Planck scale, you eventually get to kind of a bottom level where there's information there. And Roger brought in general relativity, Einstein's general relativity, which is another seeming tangent. But it all made sense because in general relativity, matter is equivalent to curvature in space-time geometry. And Einstein had predicted this, and then Eddington showed that light from a star behind the sun would curve around it during an eclipse, and proved Einstein's theory that space-time curves.
Yeah.
So Roger applied that to that was at big scales, but then Roger applied it to tiny scales, so that a quantum particle, would be a tiny curvature, and if it's in one place, it curves in one direction, and if it curves in another, if it's in another place, it curves the other direction. So the superposition, something in two places at the same time, was actually a separation in the very structure of the universe. And he showed this with these simple two-dimensional diagrams, two-dimensional space-time sheets, where instead of 4 dimensions, he had 1 dimension of space and 1 dimension of time, and a particle in one place would be a curvature over here, and another place a curvature over there. And so in superposition was the sheet kind of separating and forming a bubble or a blister. And you can imagine that if each possibility, each side of the bubble continued, you'd have multiple. It would form its own universe, and you'd have multiple worlds, which many people believe. But Roger said that these separations would be unstable, and when they reached a threshold, they would self-collapse to one state or the other, and that would produce a moment of conscious experience, a little bing or a little wow moment at the very microscopic scale, which out in the microscopic world would be we call protoconscious, because it'd be random and disconnected. But that would be the origin of consciousness, which was turning it around completely from I mentioned before the different approaches. One was that consciousness caused collapse, with the Schrodinger's cat analogy, where the cat is in superposition until somebody looks, and that was a popular idea that consciousness causes collapse, but it put consciousness outside of science in a kind of dualist position. So Roger turned it around and said, instead of consciousness causing collapse, collapse or objective reduction occurs spontaneously and causes consciousness, because this separation in space-time is unstable, and the universe kind of snaps back to one or the other, chooses one or the other, and producing a moment of consciousness. So when I realized what he was trying to say, I was pretty much blown away because it was the only. Wait, hang on. What's the matter?
Well,
because.
It sounds almost like consciousness is all around us. Then it sounds like that's kind of what he's saying. Now, if that's right,
well, I would say that at least proto-consciousness is all around us, because these little moments of collapses would be happening in the environment randomly all over the place. So kind of like panpsychism. But also all around us is when this reduction occurs, there's this influence on which state is selected. So, which is his non-computable effect. But consciousness all around us, yes, but not as a property of things, but more as a process of events that's occurring everywhere.
Ah, okay.
But only in the brain, it needs to be organized in a particular way. Now, I use a metaphor of these events happening in the environment here, there, and everywhere. It's kind of like if you go to the symphony and the musicians are warming up and each is tuning his or her instrument, and you hear a bunch of noise, a bunch of notes and tones, a cacophony, you might say. But then the orchestra starts to play, and you hear music. So the difference between that noise, the noise would be kind of like the proto-consciousness happening everywhere at a very low level, and then our microtubules organize those events into conscious moments, and it's like a symphony, except there's no conductor. It's more self-organizing. So that's what the microtubules do, to organize things and utilize this consciousness and organize it, and to optimize pleasure in the brain. I think actually life originated and evolved to optimize pleasure that was already occurring in the environment with these proto-conscious events, because some of them will be pleasurable, and I think pleasure drives evolution.
I see what you're saying. So this is kind of like this. You might almost be able to call this Gaia, then, right, or something like that.
Oh yeah. So as I understand it, Gaia is kind of this layering of life, and it's within which consciousness occurs. And I know it goes outward into the earth and so forth, but I look at it down inside. What I look at is at the lower, smaller scales, extending down inside living systems, inside the brain, inside all living cells, into the microtubules, and then into various stages of the quantum world, extending perhaps all the way down to the Planck scale at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, because Roger's idea ties consciousness and biology to this to processes in the fine scale structure of the universe, these little separations and ripples in the fabric of reality. And so it goes, I'd say Gaia goes inwards through biology, through microtubules, all the way down to the Planck scale, the bottom floor of the universe at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters.
Sure. Well, so do you think then, I mean, and I'm just kind of shooting wild here, but I mean, so we consider the brain to be what does the thinking in the mind, right? And that comes out of the old neuron, the neuron dendrite model. But is it possible that the entire body contributes to thought?
Maybe, but the brain has a lot of advantages. I think all the microtubules everywhere could be processing information, and maybe consciousness happens in certain large confluences like ganglia in the heart, like some people think. But I think, here's the thing. I think any small creature and even maybe plants can have some form of orchestrated consciousness, more than just proto-consciousness that's happening in the environment. But it's kind of like the intensity and frequency. So, for example, we could have, let's say, if we're using all the microtubules, or at least a good percentage of the microtubules throughout our brain, or at least in the pyramidal cells, we could have maybe 10 million orchestrated objective reduction moments per second. So 10 megahertz, something like that. And then with interference beats down, going slower to account for EEG, or maybe even higher, may even come from the terahertz. So consciousness can happen at various frequencies in the brain, maybe as fast as terahertz, gigahertz, megahertz, and so forth. Now, a single cell, so we can have that many moments per second, let's say 10 million. A single cell might have maybe 2 per second. So it's going to have, and these are going to be low intensity and very low information content. So I think they could have moments of awareness, but very minimal and maybe not connected that well and meaningful, but some meaning to the organism, but not very intense because of the low frequency and the low number of possible states. So low content, low intensity, but still consciousness. And you could say the same thing about plants, which respond to cognition and have like 1 microtubule per neuron. So they could have a very low frequency number of conscious moments, maybe a couple per minute or something like that.
Oh,
whereas we're having 10 million.
Yeah. Well, now, do you think that this could be connected? I'm just throwing this out there. Do you think that a lot of people believe that meditation connects them to a higher level of consciousness? And do you think that might be possible with this model, or?
Yeah, we know that meditation increases your EEG frequency up until you can still measure it. That was shown a long time ago from Davidson's lab in Wisconsin. But so I think you increase the frequency, and you might even increase the frequency so much that it goes into the quantum realm. I think that as you go up in frequency into the gigahertz, terahertz, you become more quantum and non-local, and that would be an advanced meditative state. And I think to some extent, psychedelics might do the same thing by increasing the frequency of the vibrations and pushing it more into the quantum state. If you think about consciousness as more of a musical piece with some extremely high frequency notes that bring you into another realm, really, into the quantum realm where everything's connected over distance. So meditative and altered states might push you along that axis into higher frequency, more quantum, more non-local stuff. And in fact, even near-death and after near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, if they exist, and there's pretty good evidence, could be when the quantum information is deeply into the quantum realm and into the space-time geometry itself, without necessarily needing the biology, at least temporarily. So I think that's conceivable. I don't argue for that because I don't have good evidence myself, but it's a possibility.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, that was just about everything that I wanted to cover. But I did want to ask about, now you're also the organizer of the annual Science of Consciousness conference. So, and I put this out there for people who want to get involved, but can you tell me a little bit about the conference and the folks who typically attend and how people who are interested can learn more about that?
Yes, well, unfortunately, we postponed this year's because of the coronavirus. It was going to be in April, and we've tentatively rescheduled for December, just before Christmas, the 12th and 19th. And we have it at a luxury resort in Tucson called Ventana Canyon, which is a fantastic place. Basically, when I got interested in consciousness in the 80s and 90s, there were no really interdisciplinary gatherings, and there were focus conference on the philosophy of mind or the neuroscience or this or that, but nothing brought everybody together. So I had the idea of having an interdisciplinary conference, and started one in '94 at the medical school, and it was pretty good actually. I made the mistake of dividing the talks up. So the first day was philosophy, the second day was neuroscience, third day was cognitive science. The fourth day was physics and math, and then Friday was experiential and phenomenology. Whereas really what you want to do is integrate things and put sessions, different approaches in one each session. But the point was that the first morning, the first two speakers were philosophers who were, gave these talks with no slides and were putting people to sleep. But the third speaker was Dave Chalmers, who gave this talk on the heart problem that got everybody buzzing about why we were there, to figure out why computation per se couldn't account for qualia and feelings and love and joy and all that stuff. So, and then Dave became part of it, and we moved. It became larger, and we've had the last. So it's in Tucson every other year in the even-numbered years, and odd-numbered years it's somewhere else, and it was in. Where was it last time? Oh, it was in Switzerland. Sorry, last June in Interlaken, Switzerland, which was a wonderful conference put on by Harold Ottmansbacher. And now, because of the virus, we're not sure where it'll be next year. But we hope to have the Tucson one in December, and to keep our streak going of annually since 1994. But we'll take it from there. But this year we had a lot of stuff on psychedelics because it's become real popular in terms of clinical applications used in psychiatry, and also what it can tell us about the mechanism of consciousness. We had a Nobel Prize winner talking about space and time in the brain, and some really fabulous speakers. So hopefully all of them, or at least most of them, will come back when we reschedule in December. And hopefully we can do it then, and if not, I'll put it off another year, but we'll see. But we usually get 700-800 people, and there's a lot of social events and parties and traditions, poetry slams, zombie blues, a lot of interaction, partying, and so forth. It's kind of an isolated, beautiful resort in the mountains, so people have a good time. And we've been doing it for 94. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so let me close by asking, what's the next big thing in the science of consciousness, and what projects are you personally pushing forward on there? Right.
Well, there's this competition funded by Templeton among different theories, and we're trying to prove there are a lot of theories, but they're hard to falsify because a lot of them are very vague or diagrammatic. Ours is specific in terms of quantum vibrations in microtubules, then leading to org-OR and space-time geometry. But we don't have the wherewithal right now to look at space-time geometry, although some of Roger's people are going that direction. But what we can do, and what we are doing, is looking at quantum vibrations in microtubules in the laboratory, in vitro, with a couple different groups. We're using the techniques that were used to show quantum coherence in photosynthesis proteins. So people were very skeptical about quantum biology because if you want to build a quantum computer in the laboratory, you need to do it at absolute zero temperatures to avoid thermal decoherence. So we were saying that it's happening in biology, and people said that's impossible. And, we knew about coherence. We thought it was happening somehow. And then in 2006, they discovered quantum coherence in plants in photosynthesis, that plants utilize quantum coherence. They absorb photons and then transport them as excitons to another part of the complex through 7 pathways simultaneously, and that through superposition. And that quantum superposition transport is so efficient that it allows enough of the energy to be conserved and made into chemical bonds so that we get food for us to eat plants and that animals to eat plants. So without the quantum coherence, we might not exist for that reason. But it showed that quantum biology can happen at warm temperatures and sunlight, and certainly at brain temperatures. So we're actually working with one of the people who did those experiments in photosynthesis, and we want to do it for tubulin, the microtubule protein, and another study looking at delayed luminescence. And when we get these quantum effects in tubulin, which we hope to, we will then see if they're sensitive to anesthesia, to anesthetic gases, and if the anesthetic gases dampen the quantum processes in the microtubule proportional to their potency in clinical use. In other words, proportional to how much it takes to put an animal or a human to sleep, then I think we have good arguments that the quantum vibrations are the neural correlate of consciousness. It would confirm what we showed in our computer model, but we want to show it actual biologically and experimentally. So we've got we got a proposal in, and we hope to hear about that in the next few months. So we want to demonstrate quantum vibrations in microtubules. that would validate our theory, and I think that would put us way ahead of any other theory for which there's basically no evidence for any of them. And the final thing I'd like to say is that there's a clinical application that has developed out of this, which is that if microtubules have vibrations in these different vibrational frequencies, we might be able to affect their what they're doing in the body, and particularly in the brain, in mental and cognitive disorders by resonating them. So we've been looking at vibrations using megahertz vibrations in ultrasound. So the vibrations are electromagnetic in most frequencies, but megahertz is radio frequency, electromagnetic, but it's also ultrasound and mechanical. So when I learned this through the work of Anirban Bandipati in 2009, I looked to see if anybody was putting ultrasound into the brain, and some people have been doing it in animals, showing physiological effects. So to make a long story short, we did a study on our chronic pain patients in 2013 and showed that ultrasound into the brain improved their mood and reduced their pain in a double-blind controlled study. And we want to try it for other things. And we just had a paper published in Frontiers on focusing the ultrasound to the the right inferior frontal gyrus of the prefrontal cortex, improving mood and rearranging functional connectivity by MRI. And we want to try this for chronic pain and addiction because it detaches the system from the default mode of worrying and perseverating and so forth. So I think this is a tremendous tool. There are other ways of stimulating the brain, electricity and magnetism, TMS, and so forth. But I think ultrasound is going to turn out to be the best. We want to try it for Alzheimer's, brain trauma, and a number of other things. So, and as well as addiction and mood. So I think it's a clinical spin-off of the theory because it says consciousness and a lot of important stuff is happening in microtubule vibrations.